Hello, Sawubona, Dumela. Do you know anything about South African tax residency? Well, you should. Whether you are a South African citizen living abroad or a foreign national considering a move to this beautiful country, understanding the rules and regulations surrounding tax residency is crucial. So what does tax resident mean? Simply put, if you are seen as a South African tax resident for a particular year, then SARS, which is the South African tax man, will tax you on all your income, both locally, as in within South Africa, and internationally. Okay, so you're probably thinking, if I live in South Africa, then I'm a South African tax resident, and if I don't, then I'm not. Well, that's not always the case. There are two ways to check if you're a South African tax resident. The first way is called the ordinarily resident test. Basically, the ordinarily resident test says that you will be a South African tax resident if South Africa is where you return after traveling. So, if you spend 9 months working in Europe, but you still return to South Africa after your travels, then you are ordinarily resident in South Africa, and you have to pay your taxes in South Africa. SARS, the South African tax collector, looks at things like your nationality and your foreign visa, as well as details about your South African properties, assets, interests, family, and reasons for returning to South Africa. All of these factors play a role to determine if you're a South African tax resident or not. The other way to determine South African tax residency is by using the physical presence test. The physical presence test is only used if you are not seen as a tax resident by the ordinarily resident test. The physical presence test is based on the amount of time that you physically spend inside of South Africa, and there are 3 points that need to be met for the physical presence test to be true. Firstly, you must have spent 91 days or more in South Africa in the current year of assessment. Secondly, you must have spent 91 days or more in each of the preceding 5 years of assessment. And lastly, you must have spent over 915 days in total during those preceding 5 years of assessment. If all 3 of these points are true, then you will be considered to be physically present in South Africa and you'll be a South African tax resident. If just one of the criteria is not met, then you are not considered to be physically present in South Africa, so you are not a South African tax resident by the way of physical presence test. It's important to note that if you are a South African tax resident by way of the physical presence test, this tax residency can be broken by leaving South Africa for a stretch of 330 continuous days. Remember, the physical presence test will only be considered if you are not ordinarily resident in South Africa. There's one more thing that you need to take note of. If you are a South African resident living abroad and you earn foreign employment income, you may still have to pay some income tax to SARS. Any remuneration received in excess of 1.25 million rands is now subject to normal tax in South Africa, even if you've already paid your income taxes in the foreign country. South Africans who should be particularly concerned about this are those who live in countries with no income tax or income tax that is very low in comparison to South Africa. If you think that this applies to you, contact BlueLine Capital for assistance with your financial immigration. Okay, so now let's say you've been working in America for the past 10 years. You may realize that you're a dual resident because you are a tax resident in both the US and in South Africa. This is where a double tax agreement comes into play. A double tax agreement is an agreement between two countries which is set up to avoid the same income being taxed twice. So the double tax agreement is your friend in a way. With the DTA, you're only taxed once, either in South Africa or in the foreign country. Now, let's quickly clarify some dates. For the ordinarily resident test, you will start being a tax resident of South Africa as soon as you become ordinarily resident in the country. So if your family immigrates from Australia to South Africa on the 5th of June 2025, then you will become a South African tax resident on this day. The end date for the ordinarily resident test is the date when you are no longer seen as ordinarily resident. With regards to the physical presence test, you will start being a South African tax resident from the first day of the tax year in which you met all the requirements of the physical presence test. The date on which you will cease to be a resident in terms of the physical presence test will be the last day you were in South Africa before leaving for a continuous period of 330 days. Remember, if you are deemed to be ordinarily resident in South Africa and you are outside of the country for more than 330 days, you are still a South African tax resident because you are ordinarily resident in South Africa, and that is the country that you are eventually going to return to after your travels. If you do cease to be a South African tax resident, you have to notify SARS by updating your RAV1 form on the e-filing platform. This form is a registration, amendment, and verification form, and it can be found under the Income Liability Details section on e-filing. Once you've updated this form, SARS will request some supporting documents that you must submit through e-filing. Be warned, SARS may not make this easy for you. If you don't submit sufficient proof, SARS will decline your declaration and you will still be taxed as a South African tax resident. But don't worry, Steve and Yvonne at BlueLine Capital will handle all your immigration-related financial matters for a bargain fee of 5,500 Rand. Call, WhatsApp, or email with the details provided on screen. So, what do you need to submit? First, you need the signed declaration indicating the basis on which you qualify. This declaration basically states that you are no longer a South African tax resident because you are no longer ordinarily resident or because you no longer meet the criteria of the physical presence test. Next, you will need to submit a letter of motivation with detailed description of the fact and circumstances to support the disclosure that you have ceased to be a South African tax resident. And finally, you will need a copy of your passport or travel diary. These are the 3 standard submissions that you need to make. If you indicated that you are no longer ordinarily resident, then you need to also provide some additional documents. You will need to disclose the following. Firstly, you must disclose the type of visa on which you have gone to the foreign country. Then you must provide proof of residence in the foreign country. You must also produce a tax residence certificate from the Foreign Revenue Authority or a letter from them that indicates that you are regarded as a tax resident in that country. You will need to submit all the details of the South African property that you own and also provide the purposes of this property. You need to submit the details of any South African business interests, like investments, that you have. You'll also need to provide all of your family details. You have to indicate if any family members are in South Africa and the reason thereof. Next, you must disclose the details of your social interest in South Africa, like gym contracts, recreational clubs, and other societies. You must also disclose the location of your personal belongings and provide details of any return visits to South Africa, as well as the frequency thereof and the reason for undertaking such visits. If you cease to be a resident by way of the physical presence test, then you do not need to submit any additional documents. And if you cease to be a resident due to a double tax agreement, you will just need to submit a tax residence certificate from the Foreign Revenue Authority or a letter from them that indicates that you are regarded as a tax resident in that country. So that's it. That's all you need to know about South African tax residency. For more assistance with financial immigration from South Africa, use the details on screen to contact Steve or Yvonne at BlueLine Capital. BlueLine Capital are experts in financial immigration and have been helping South Africans living abroad for more than 5 years.